to a session that really captures the diversity of the Kolkata literary meet. We have next with us Janam Mukherjee. I would like to invite him onto stage. He is going to be speaking on his book, Hungry Bengal. Very briefly, Janam Mukherjee is an associate professor of history at Toronto Metropolitan University. His book, Hungry Bengal, War, Famine, Riots and the End of Empire, incorporates extensive archival and oral history research to draw structural links between war, famine, social upheaval, and civil violence in the mid-20th century of Bengal. Mr. Mukherjee is also an anti-war activist, musician, and creative writer. I will now hand over the mic to him.
Completely different. I prepared a piece to read today. It's a somewhat performative piece. My work is on the Bengal famine and the period of the 1940s. The topic of this talk, how the Bengal famine shaped history. I will simply begin by reading this piece then. Between the years of 1943 and 1946, somewhere between 3 and 5 million men, women, and children died of famine in Bengal. That makes the Bengal famine of 1943, which it has ever since been known, one of the largest single mass death events of World War II. What's more, from the earliest analysis of famine in Bengal, it has been well understood that this mass death event, claiming millions of Bengali lives, was man-made. If we take these two facts together, that of 3 to 5 million Bengalis dead, and the fact that this famine was man-made, with human agency behind that mass death, we are confronted by the very grave historical conclusion that during World War II, 3 to 5 million people in Bengal were essentially exterminated by identifiable actors, agents, and machinations of power. In my own historical work, I have tried to detail the complexity of the workings of the power machine that produced famine in Bengal in real time. It is a grinding assembly line of loot, misappropriation, disregard, pernicious social hierarchy, greed, authoritarianism, and administrative failure. I will give some summary of those findings here before moving on to talk about the legacies of famine in Bengal. They too are complex. On September 3rd of 1939, when England declared war on Germany, it also declared war against Germany on behalf of its far-flung empire. Subsequently, the idea of total war began to underwrite all domestic as well as colonial policy. Though an attack by Germany on India was highly improbable, mobilization in India began on a large scale immediately after war was declared. An air raid precaution service was established in the cities of Bengal, which, together with the civic and home guards, amounted to an ad hoc colonial militia of more than 200,000 loyalists by 1943. Meanwhile, the Indian National Congress, the country's primary nationalist organ, withdrew from participation in colonial governance in protest at having been bootstrapped into Britain's war. Without the participation of the INC, Britain's experiment in participatory colonialism also failed, and much of the country reverted to direct emergency rule. This allowed colonial authorities to wield an especially authoritarian hammer during the entire course of the war. India, in this sense, amounted to an occupied country for the duration of World War II. At the head of empire as a whole was a man named Winston Churchill, whose racism and disdain for Indians in particular made that hammer especially heavy. When Japan entered the war in December of 1941 and Singapore and Burma fell just a few short months later, Bengal became the Axis-allied front of conflict in Asia, and Calcutta became the main supply front for a formidable war against an intractable enemy. Calcutta also became a prime target for further Japanese advance, which bred considerable administrative unease in the former colonial capital. The British were shocked by the humiliating defeats they had been dealt across Southeast Asia, and so dug in their heels in Bengal with a frenzied resolve. Calcutta rapidly began filling up with British as well as American troops, and the factories that supplied the war machine kicked into overdrive. Laborers were recruited from the far reaches of Bengal's impossibly vast hinterland to keep the supply train running. Meanwhile, the province of Bengal had been labeled a dangerous area, and the Essential Services Act made it a punishable offense for factory or dock workers to leave their jobs in the event of bombings or enemy attack. But as the rhetoric of defense escalated further, military protection of the all-important city of Calcutta remained minimal at best. The plan then that the colonial government did come up with in lieu of actual military preparation amounted to a scorched earth campaign in Bengal, the denial scheme as it was called. The first measure of the denial scheme was to confiscate all the so-called surplus rice in coastal districts so that Japan could not appropriate food provisions in the event of an overland attack on Calcutta. Towards this end, government agents appointed through political and commercial channels, backed by law enforcement and military, went into the countryside and snatched up all the rice that could be found, paying whatever price they deemed appropriate, and wreaking total chaos on existing market structures in the process. No real effort was made to establish which rice was surplus and which essential, and as such, the scheme appeared to the people of Bengal as an open loot. Agents also operated freely outside the denial zone itself. The rice swept up in denial would, ostensibly, be used to feed industrial labor in Calcutta. But much of the rice removed seems to have been hoarded in private warehouses or shipped out of Bengal in record exports leaving the province just at this time. After rice denial, the colonial regime moved on to a scheme of boat denial. The idea here was to deny potential Japanese landing forces the opportunity of appropriating local conveyance in the event of an advance on Calcutta. The Delta of Bengal is one of the most complex waterways in the world, and the country boats of Bengal represented the essential form of transport across much of the province. During the denial scheme, in the period of a few short months, a total of more than 46,000 boats were requisitioned for military purposes, sunken, destroyed, or otherwise removed from service, crippling the riverine economic infrastructure of deltaic Bengal. Subsequently, as life in the districts began to deteriorate without local transport, those who had fled Calcutta months earlier in fear of Japanese attack began straggling back into the city in search of increasingly scarce resources. Accordingly, the needs of the city, already serving as a war base for many hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, escalated still further. Then, on December 20th of 1942, Calcutta was bombed for the first time by Japanese aircraft. Panic gripped the city. Singapore and then Rangoon had withered under Japanese attack, and evacuations had been chaotic and humiliating. Most alarmingly, when Calcutta was bombed, rice merchants and large stockists, many of whom were Marwaris with roots elsewhere, fled the city for safer harbors, even while the colonial government had to keep the war machine functioning. Nervous of their access to rice for industrial laborers and the military in and around Calcutta, government agents broke into shuttered private warehouses and requisitioned all the rice that they could find. 2/3 of the duly declared rice stocks in Calcutta were summarily seized, and in the process, this very influential and well-connected Indian merchant class of Calcutta was deeply estranged from the colonial authority. The trade system from root to branch was thrown into complete disarray, and as prices skyrocketed, more and more supplies went into a thriving black market. In Calcutta, as rice markets became increasingly volatile, government and industrial interests descended again and again on the countryside to raid it of the rice and paddy in order to offset the increasing uncertainty regarding supplies in the city. There is considerable historical evidence to confirm that speculative hoarding by these same conjoined forces, industrial, governmental, and colonial, took place on a large scale, with jute and cotton mills, the railways, rice merchants, banks, large landholders, and tea gardens purchasing large stocks of rice from all over the province and removing them to Calcutta or otherwise withholding them from markets. This dynamic struck markets to the core, panicked householders, and was a primary cause of the meteoric rise in prices across the province, which in turn was a primary cause of famine in Bengal. The industrial interests of Calcutta in particular exercised tremendous influence on price and market policy, with important members of this same community sitting on the Viceroy's Executive Council in Delhi. These interests were both British and Indian alike, with chambers of commerce being operated by the likes of Edward Benthall and G.D. Birla, respectively. This aspect of industrial appropriation through military and governmental auspices and hoarding and speculation by big business interests has to be identified as another primary cause of mass death in Bengal. At the very advent of the war, the British had enacted an excess profits tax to fund the war effort and to curb profiteering, a well-understood byproduct of wartime industrial booms across the planet. Excess profit taxes had been enacted in Britain as well, and in many countries around the world. It had been during World War I, in fact, that the Indian industrial houses had gained their first foothold on the GDP of India. Through a cornering of jute markets in particular, the future industrialists of India had made enormous profits in commodity speculation, paving the way for their entry into Indian big business. Unsurprisingly then, the enactment of an excess profits tax at the advent of World War II was reviled by this same community. They lobbied the government of India fiercely, and in August of 1942 succeeded in getting a provision to write off food grains purchases against the excess profits tax. Shortly thereafter, a Bengal Chambers foodstuff scheme, as it was called, came into effect, and the various chambers of commerce began large-scale purchases in the countryside. Their constituent firms, meanwhile, continued to purchase on their own accounts. It actually behooved them to purchase at high prices as a further hedge against the excess profits tax, which drove prices up still further. The fear of Japanese attack, the entwined interests of industrial profits and colonial government, and the mania to keep war production at a fevered pitch led to repeated schemes of appropriation in the countryside that partnered commercial, colonial, and military interests in fleecing Bengal of rice. Citing the increasingly scarce supplies in open markets as more and more rice was removed therefrom, the mantra of feeding Calcutta at all costs grew ever louder. And it must be noted, All this time, it was the provincial government, not the industrial firms themselves, that was supplying rice at control shops for industrial workers in Calcutta, who numbered approximately 600,000 at this time. All things considered, not a large population to feed. After the airstrikes of December 1942, as I've had mentioned, government broke into warehouses in Calcutta and seized the rice of important merchants who had fled the city. They, in turn, threatened to break down in war manufacturing if free and unobstructed access to rice markets was not allowed. That was granted in early 1943, and the various chambers of commerce, as well as their constituent firms, again in partnership with colonial governance and its military backing, raided the countryside for rice. Where all this rice was in fact going is not entirely clear. What is clear is that by the time it was released onto open markets in early 1944, it was rotten. In any case, by mid-1943, the price of rice was, in some places, 40 times the indexed level of 1939. Starvation was already decimating the countryside, and a tremendous upheaval of the poor of Bengal was already underway. Starving people began descending on Calcutta, this city of plenty, in their tens and then hundreds of thousands. They died on the streets, choked back alleyways, and rent the air with their desperate pleas. Pando! Pando! Bachao! Ma! Pando! They were begging for the runoff of water from cooked rice in the established households of Calcutta. In the villages, they died in their hundreds of thousands, unheard. Bodies floated in canals or were torn apart by wild dogs in abandoned fields. All this time, it should be said, record profits were continuing on in Calcutta. And in London, Winston Churchill was manipulating the War Cabinet into rejecting every petition for food imports into India. Meanwhile, the streets of Calcutta were being policed by ARP, and starving Bengalis were being rounded up by main force and removed to concentration camps that gave less calories per day than were being given by the Nazis at Buchenwald, even as large stores of rice were rotting in corporate godowns. Famine is in some sense the most poisonous and pronounced decantation of power in its ugliest form. It is a thoroughgoing and complete dehumanization that has no analog. At the point of starvation, a body does not simply wither up and die. Rather, starvation is a complex battle of forces that excoriate, deform, and eventually annihilate the bodies and minds that it is allowed to prey upon. It is a humiliating, indecent, and relentless process of deterioration, organs failing one by one, a host of opportunistic diseases taking root, and madness often accompanying. The reduction of people to starvation through man-made processes and policies is, in some definite sense, a concretization of a differential value accorded to different strata of human life by the power structure itself. It is the ultimate exempling of existential difference. If, as according to colonial pretension, for instance, these colonized people are weak and beggarly, if they are incapable and scurrilous, there is no more pronounced argument towards this end than to actually reduce a whole population to pleading skeletons, dying without marker or name. That is famine. It is the very imprint of authoritarian power on human bodies. The focus of this talk, however, was to be on the way that the Bengal famine shaped history. That existential argument of life and death and the value accorded to differentiated communities accordingly is a good place to start. In Bengal, the very depopulation of whole villages, the loss of lands, the uprooting of tens of millions more by hunger, for those masses, famine is not an event that has ever been resolved. And famine for those same many millions, and now their descendants, only continues on at a lower grade. Their struggles have been material, intergenerational, and unending. In the years immediately following the famine, there was an uprising amongst sharecroppers, the community probably most deeply affected by starvation, which was put down with military force by the newly minted post-colonial governments of both India and Pakistan in Bengal. In that sense, the legacy of famine is written into an order of state authority that will disallow a revolution of structures which could go some way towards a rectification of the mechanisms of power that cost the lives of millions of Bengalis. If we look at another primary factor in the analysis of famine in Bengal, the centralization of Calcutta, profit, and capital, there are important conclusions to be drawn as well. The enormous profits made by the Indian industrial class operating in Calcutta in the 1940s in particular are extremely important to examine more closely. In some ways, and as I have gone some way towards illuminating, those record profits were made in some definite sense directly at the expense of the people of Bengal. It might also be noted that the preponderance of this same class had come from outside of Bengal to exploit the wartime boom that enriched them. It was this capital, too, which directly underwrote the independence struggle in its final years. For this reason, this same community wielded tremendous influence in the shaping of the post-colonial state. As early as April 1944, even while famine was still decimating Bengal, the Federated Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the FICCI, was hatching concrete and detailed plans for the organization of an eventual national economy. Their priorities of profit, industrial welfare, and fiscal support for big business were outlined in what became known as the Bombay Plan. Its signers, J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Purushottam Das Thakurdas, Ardeshir Dalal, Lala Shriram, Kasturbai Lalbai, A.D. Shroff, and John Mathai had all made fortunes in the wartime economy, and now were wielding the influence behind those fortunes freely. This was a dominant lobby, not only in Delhi, but in London as well. Calcutta-based industrial tycoon and financial titan G.D. Birla, in particular, operated as a go-between between the Indian National Congress and British parliamentarians throughout the transfer of power. At the heart of the Bombay Plan was an initiative to see a 500% increase in industrial production in the first 5 years of independence. Meanwhile, despite continuing famine, the plan penciled in suggestions for a measly 130% increase in agricultural production. In addition, the plan for industrial increase at the expense of agricultural increase was to be financed by what were called sterling balances, owed to India by Britain in relation to its unpaid accounts for war materials and personnel during World War II. It was essentially a deferred lend-lease program with India begun at the beginning of the war. That IOU, by the end of the war, stood at 1.2 billion pounds, equivalent to about 50 billion pounds today. That India had to foot the bill for a significant percentage of Britain's war effort in Asia was a direct and primary cause of the overall crippling inflation that had impoverished hundreds of millions across India and had led to mass death in Bengal. Those sterling balances were, in that same sense, blood money. The authors of the Bombay Plan, however, though they themselves had become unimaginably enriched in that same economy, and in fact had made their fortunes in that same borrowed currency, apparently saw little irony in now claiming this famine money too as their own. Although the Congress left was advertising a socialist-style post-colonial economy, their own planning was ineffective. The Indian National Congress was riven by ideological acrimony, and big business interests remained at the table throughout the planning process, wielding tremendous influence in the sphere of the economic planning that would determine the structure of post-colonial India. In the end, and as according to eminent historian Aditya Mukherjee, the National Planning Committee's proposal was in no way fundamentally different from the Bombay Plan. And finally, in the newly minted government, it was arch-conservative Bombay planner John Mathai who was to be the first finance minister of independent India. Famine, in this sense, remained nested at the very heart of the nationalist project. But this nesting was not only an economic nesting, it was an ideological one as well. The constellations of corporate power and Hindu nationalism that are everywhere apparent in India today can be seen to have definite roots in the period of war and famine. Many of those same Indian capitalists funding political nationalism, and again G.D. Birla is notable in this regard, were also at the heart of the Hindu nationalist project, also funding that project liberally with monies made in trade and industry during the World War. One of the earliest mentions of partition that I have come across in voluminous research on the whole period is from G.D. Birla in January of 1938. He poses the question to Gandhi's secretary, Mahadev Desai, "I wonder why it would not be possible to have two federations, one of Muslims and another of Hindus." Then Birla's brother B.M. writes to Vallabhbhai Patel in 1947, 2 days after partition had been announced, "Is it not time that we should consider Hindustan as a Hindu state, with Hinduism as the state religion?" It should be remembered that West Bengal especially was important to the Hindu nationalist project because of the industries of Calcutta. Calcutta especially could not be lost to a united Bengal. In terms of legacies of famine, the cultural impacts of famine on the population of Bengal have been immense as well. In the wake of the Bengal famine, the legacy of hunger structured collective identity of Bengali people as a whole for many generations to come. Writers, painters, sculptors, poets, dramatists, and filmmakers all labored under the banner of hungry Bengal. When I first began researching the 1940s in Bengal, the living memory of war, and especially famine, was still very much present in Bengali culture. It seemed that in any house I visited in Calcutta, there were members of the household who could recall from personal experience the turmoil of war and the depredations of famine. Memories, although already more than 50 years old, were sharp and insistent. Even on buses and street corners, I would happen upon elderly denizens of the city who, when they discovered my purpose, were eager to talk. The cataclysmic history to which they had borne witness seemed bottled up inside of them and needed to get out. Often enough, our discussion ended with profuse gratitude that I had come to listen. For so many years already, they had been telling their tales to children and then grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. But who could really understand the gravity of those memories and their importance? What did they mean? One of the most ubiquitous refrains I heard from the earliest days of my research was that the famine of 1943, that inhuman spectacle that each and every elderly person I interviewed had witnessed, was in fact man-made. And so the emphasis of my own work has been less on the pathos of starvation than on the architectures of power and disempowerment that brought it to pass. Colonialism, it is abundantly evident, was perhaps the necessary condition of famine in mid-20th century Bengal. But as my research deepened, I came to fully recognize that colonialism itself is not a monolith, and the enactments and agencies that precipitated starvation in Bengal are complex. Who collaborated with the colonial state in its predatory policies that left a whole province reeling in starvation? And what did they have to gain? A second all but ubiquitous trace of memory that I encountered in my rounds was an oral fragment that I heard repeatedly by everyone whom I had interviewed. Pando! Pando! Bachao! Ma! Pando! It is the sound of begging in the streets of Calcutta during famine. Give us the starch water from your cooked rice, mother. Save us. Give us the remnants of your rice pot. It is the voice of starving villagers who flooded the streets and by lanes of Calcutta, wretched and skeletal, covered in sores, many dying within days of arrival or being rounded up and disappeared by authorities in the dead of the night. I've heard their voices over and over again, theatrically enacted by dozens of middle-class survivors of that period. Questions concerning the manufacture of famine are essentially empirical questions. The questions that this second trace of memory elicit are, if anything, still more complex. Why did these starving and wretched villagers dying on the streets of Calcutta only beg for rice water? And why is this particular fragment so embedded in the collective memory of famine in Bengal? In established households of Calcutta, solid brick-built homes, there were indeed stockpiles of rice. That category includes the vast majority of those survivors from the 1940s whom I have interviewed. When in early 1942, the government of India had advised the Bengal Chamber of Commerce to inform its members to begin stockpiling at least 3 months' worth of foodstuffs, that created panic. The edict was quickly broadened to include the general public, and a scramble for rice at every local level ensued. Only in established households in Calcutta were there the kind of connections and resources necessary to make large purchases of food stores. In many houses, there were stocks sufficient for 6 months and more. What does it mean to be asked for only rice water when you're sitting on a small mountain of rice? To what extent does your own fear of survival inform that wretched and minimalist plea? In a number of the interviews I conducted, people recounted very individualized depictions of death by starvation day by day. A wretched woman to whom one's father had given cooked food only the day before she died. Did they only beg for pan because that is all that women could give, overseeing the cooking but certainly not the supplies? Is that eerie memory of those dying voices a gendered memory as well? And in a more general sense, what does it mean to live out your survival in direct and face-to-face confrontation with the fact that your survival is in direct contrast to this other person's annihilation? In the pathos with which that phrase is recanted by survivors of the 1940s, is there also the sadness of an unspeakable guilt and helplessness? Bombs were falling on the city. Anything could happen. Had fear throttled charity to the extent that nothing more could be expected than famine? These are, in a definite sense, moral questions. In the present times we are living through, the focus of my thoughts return again and again to that fragment of sound and the moral riddle that it has always held for me. Pando, Pando, Bachao, Ma, Pando, Pando. That plaintive echo emanating from skeletal bodies that rent the air with sorrow and distress. Is it not some sort of miracle that while the bodies of those who issued those pleas have so long ago been annihilated, Their voices have spanned these generations. What should we make of those voices now? The vast majority who died without ever being named. Then how do their voices still remain? In all the uncertainty and turmoil of our present condition, with the shibboleths of authoritarianism, war, and social division being worshipped with manic insistence, in this all but deafening cacophony of present-day life, could these thin voices from a distant past, echoing across decades, have anything at all to say to us? Maybe it is that we are not alone. Maybe it is that we are all connected, no matter how profound the cleavages of privilege and power. Maybe it is that if we give nothing but thin gruel in response to great need, we too will be haunted by voices until the end of our days. It is entirely likely that not a soul who is hearing this right now will go hungry tonight. In these present times, questions about privilege and disempowerment and how they interface are perhaps still the most critical questions of all. Why did they only beg for pan? And why did the pleading voices of those who died in that Holocaust of hunger remain so stubbornly embedded in the memories of those who survived the Bengal famine for so long? It does make one wonder. Sure.
On a complaint and on a question. First, let us come to the complaint. So, in your book, you have given a vivid details of Ian Stephens and his effort in the Statesman newspaper. How Ian Stephens exposed by fighting with his own Statesman management, by fighting with Viceroy in Delhi, and also Statesman office in London. Wonderful, sir. Sir, my grievance is, when Ian Stephens was described by you so vividly in this book, why a man named Tapan Das, who was the photographer of Amrita Bazar Patrika, Tarak Das, sorry, he was a photographer of Amrita Bazar Patrika, and a cartoonist named Kafi Khan. They also exposed Bengal famine in Amrita Bazar Patrika in a great extent. Somehow, sir, I found that that particular mention was not in your book. This is my grievance. My question is, sir, in your vivid research, have you ever come across with any tangible testimonials or evidence that Shama Prasad Mukherjee, as a minister of Fazlul Haq government, was anyhow responsible for this famine? Because I have read somewhere, after the famine, there was an investigation where it was found M.A. Ishpahani, who was very close to Surawardi and other Muslim League's leaders, they were responsible for this famine and for this rice denial, what you have written. But why there is a narrative by left-leaning people that Shama Prasad Mukherjee is anyhow responsible for this? And they give a reference of Chitto Prasad, who is not a historian, who was only an artist in Indian People's Theatre. What is your take in this?
First of all, I would say Chitto Prasad is not only an artist in the IPTA theater, he's a journalist. He's a journalist on the ground. Some of the only records we have of the voices of people who actually starved are recorded by Chitto Prasad. So Chitto Prasad's work is extremely important in that sense because we have no other real documentary evidence of what people were feeling, thinking about the circumstances they were in. The question of Shama Prasad, as far as I know, Chitto Prasad himself visited Shama Prasad's home village in Hooghly and found there considerable stockpiles of rice. But in terms of the policy that led to famine, by the time Shama Prasad resigned from the assembly, those decisions are made. The denial scheme is coming down from the empire, right? It's coming down from colonial authority. It's not a provincial action, right? It's an action taken by the war cabinet to deny Japanese. So the provincial government has no such scope in terms of defense of Bengal to enact the denial program, which in fact utilized considerable military resources. But those resources militarily were partnered with commercial interests, right? So the actual merchants were selected by the community of commercial and often industrialists in Calcutta. Those merchants went into denial as well as non-denial districts and began snapping up all the rice they could get their hands on. So I guess that somewhat answers your question. I mean, I don't see any direct necessary. I can't hear. My hearing is so bad. Ishbahani, in the long litany of names of people associated with the Bengal famine, who, if there was a real inquiry, right? If we had anything like a peace and reconciliation inquiry, or an inquiry into this mass death, which, as I say, is one of the largest single mass death events in Bengal, the list of people who would come would have to be heard is vast, including numerous colonial officials, numerous governmental officials. Of all those people, Ishbahani was the one person who actually was indicted, right? He was, and a hearing was made, and it was found through judicial processes that he had not misappropriated the money that was given for the denial period. So, you know, I can only go by historical facts. The question of this kind of historical memory in Bengal, and Ishbahani in particular, is one that is very steeped, I think, in later politics and in a certain perception of modern West Bengal.
Would you also indict the Indian National Congress leadership for not having done enough to protest? Gandhiji, from my recall of history, was ensconced in Bihar. He did write a few letters, but was that adequate? Rabindranath Tagore was unwell, ailing. He wrote a few letters. So the voices that were relevant in India, India's leadership at that point in time, did it do adequately or as much as they might have?
You know, 42, you have the Quit India movement in August of 42. So the Congress was essentially in jail this whole time, right? But let me go on. If we look at the Quit India movement itself, we see that famine was very much at the root of the Quit India movement. Gandhi wrote that the appropriation of boats in Bengal in his weekly journal, right? That the appropriation of boats in Bengal would cause starvation in Bengal. And in the name of those millions who were put to the wall by the British policies of denial, that they would call out a movement. The British response to the Quit India movement, and then the Indian National Congress came up with a much broader kind of proposal on July 10th, before the Quit India movement actually was undertaken. But in fact, the British response to the Quit India movement was based on the idea that going against the denial scheme in Bengal would be an act of treason against the country. So the entire repressive apparatus of the British state was designed in response to Gandhi's protest against denial. So that's one thing. Gandhi's fast of February of 1943, Gandhi himself said, "I'm fasting for the starving millions in India." They had a leaders' conference. All the, Congress members were in jail at that time. At that leaders' conference, you had mostly industrialists meeting to support Gandhi's fast. They made no mention of the starving millions that Gandhi had made meaningful mention of when he began the fast. So again, I mean, Gandhi is such a controversial figure, obviously, and with good reason, but Gandhi did have some sort of understanding and perception of what the poor in India were facing and what they were facing in Bengal. Outside of that, no, there is not much of a peep out of the political leadership of India until it became politically expedient to pick up on the famine. And to get back to credit given, thank you for giving credit to Amrita Bazar Patrika and for that interjection. You know, I foreground the Statesman because that was the first to come out and because it was so important internationally also, but that's a correct point.
following your comment about Gandhi's protest about the denial program by the British, is it true, I mean, while doing your research, that some ministers of his cabinet did protest and on the file made notes that there was rotting grains, rice and other food supplies where trains were being sent for troops, British troops, but they didn't need that kind of food, and that transportation of this food continued. Food was rotting in warehouses, and Winston Churchill's response was, has Gandhiji died? Not Gandhiji, has Gandhi died?
Has he died yet,
Yes,
he
yes,
says,
has
when Gandhi is undergoing his fast. The thing about looking historically at an event where 5 million people are annihilated is that there just simply is a tremendous amount of complexity. There has been in public discourse, both in the UK and in India, a kind of reviling of Winston Churchill, which in many ways is well-deserved. The last person to defend Winston Churchill. But in studies of mass deaths, certainly like Holocaust studies, for instance, it's been a long time since you could simply point at Hitler, right? We need to understand the various mechanisms of authority and the chains of command and the different agencies exercised at various levels of society also. It's not enough to point the finger at the big man. If we are serious about understanding how 5 million people die, and 5 million people dying is no joke, right? This is the largest, one of the largest single mass death events in World War II. We need to, if we are interested in understanding, in redeeming the people who died, if we're willing to give them the kind of human value that they deserve a very serious, critical understanding of what went on. So many of the economic structures that led to famine carried over into the independence period. This is just a fact. And it's a fact that was very much manipulated by those people who had made their fortunes during the famine and in direct relation to the famine. So, we have to look at economic structures. We have to look at social structures. This is why I end on this Fan Dao question. In Calcutta, people were sitting on mountains of rice. It's just a fact. I mean, I know this from people I've interviewed. I know it from my own family who were not wealthy, a kind of middle-class family. And the fact of the matter is, people are dying on their doorsteps. There was also the lack of recognition of those people dying in the countryside for months beforehand, if not for years, as there is today still in relation to Calcutta and the Bengal countryside, a blindness to these struggles, to the malnutrition that's happening, to the poverty, to the hunger, to the despair. So these questions of understanding, of community, of class, of power, of colonialism, of authority, of incompetence also. The colonial state by the time of the Bengal famine was a failing state. I mean, it simply was not capable of doing all that much. They were on their back foot. They had gotten their, almost swore, butts kicked in Southeast Asia. They were on their heels in India. They were despised. They were fighting a massive all-points rebellion in 1942 in India. They were demoralized. Their home country was being bombed. So these people were also simply not capable of administrating a country like India at the time. Thank you.